The morning of 7th August 1944 smelled like burning fuel and crushed wheat. General Hans von Funk stood at the forward command post near Mortagne, France, and watched the last of his Tiger tanks roll west through a corridor so narrow that the exhaust from the lead vehicle was still hanging in the air when the fourth tank passed through it. The ground shook in a low, metronomic pulse. His radio operator handed him a decoded message, and von Funk read it twice without speaking. The order had come from Hitler himself, transmitted through OKW, stamped with the kind of authority that did not invite reply. Operation Lüttich. 5 panzer divisions would drive west through Mortagne toward Avranches, sever the single road through which Patton's Third Army was pouring south into the French interior, and reverse the entire direction of the campaign in one stroke. The order specified the axis of advance, the timing, the objectives, and the units to be used. It specified almost everything except the one thing that mattered most. What would happen to those 5 panzer divisions if the attack failed to reach Avranches before the Americans understood what was moving toward them? Von Funk's chief of operations had placed a map on the field table. On it, the planned line of advance was drawn in blue grease pencil, a straight westward arrow. But around that arrow, if you looked at the map the way a professional looked at a map, something else was visible. To the north, British and Canadian forces were pressing down from Caen. To the south, Patton's columns were already past the point the arrow was meant to cut. The 5 panzer divisions driving west would not be cutting off the Americans. They would be extending themselves into a space that was, with every passing hour, becoming enclosed on 3 sides. There was a name for what that map was showing. The men in the room could see it. Whether anyone would say it, and whether anyone would be listened to if they did, was a different question entirely. Part 1. The system that should have stopped him. The German army that invaded France in 1940 had a command philosophy unlike anything in the world. It was called Auftragstaktik, mission tactics, and it had been built over more than a century by men who understood something fundamental about the chaos of battle, that no plan survives first contact with the enemy, and that the only way to win in a fluid situation is to push decision-making authority down to the lowest possible level. A platoon commander in the German army was expected not just to follow orders, but to understand the intent behind them, and to act on that intent, even when the orders themselves had become obsolete. A division commander was expected to tell his corps commander when a planned operation was suicidal, and to be heard. The intellectual foundation of this system was laid in the 1800s by men like Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, who had commanded Prussian forces through the wars of German unification. Moltke believed that a commander who issued detailed orders and then waited for reports was a commander who had already lost. His doctrine was built on a single principle: define the objective clearly, give your subordinates the resources they need, then trust them to find the path. The German word for this trust was Vertrauen. It was not a soft concept, it was a structural one. It meant that the system only worked if the man at the top was willing to accept that his generals knew things he did not, and that their judgment in the field outweighed his judgment in the map room. By 1939, this system had produced the most tactically flexible army on earth. The panzer commanders who drove through the Ardennes in May of 1940, men like Heinz Guderian and Erwin Rommel, were operating on the principle that they should advance faster than their orders permitted, that initiative was a virtue and hesitation a crime. Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps crossed the Meuse at Sedan on the 13th of May 1940 and then simply kept going. His orders said to establish a bridgehead. He interpreted that as permission to drive for the English Channel. He covered 260 kilometers in 9 days. Nobody stopped him because nobody had the authority to stop him, and because stopping him would have been wrong. That was the system working perfectly. Now hold that picture in your mind. Hold it, because what happened between 1940 and 1944 is the story of that system being dismantled from the inside. Hitler had never been comfortable with Auftragstaktik, even when it was winning him his wars. He had the instincts of a corporal, and he had been a corporal in the First World War, a runner in the trenches who had seen what happened when orders were not followed precisely. He believed in his own operational judgment with an intensity that bordered on delusion, and the victories of 1940 and 1941 had confirmed that belief in his own mind. When his generals had counselled caution before the French campaign, he had overruled them and been proved right. When they had argued against the attack on Yugoslavia in April of 1941, he had overruled them and been proved right again. By the summer of 1941, when German panzers were driving deep into the Soviet Union, Hitler had concluded that his generals were constitutionally incapable of the boldness that modern war required. He was the one who saw the big picture. They were the ones who counted losses and asked for reserves. The first systematic dismantling of Auftragstaktik came in December of 1941, when the German advance on Moscow stalled and the Red Army launched its winter counteroffensive. Several German army commanders wanted to conduct fighting withdrawals to give ground in order to preserve their forces and create defensible lines. This was textbook military doctrine. Hitler refused. He issued his famous Haltebefehl, stand fast order, and relieved 35 senior generals in the space of 6 weeks. Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the commander-in-chief of the army, was gone. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock was gone. Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb was gone. In their place, Hitler appointed himself commander-in-chief of the army. He was now, simultaneously, head of state, supreme commander of the armed forces, and direct commander of the German army. Think about what that meant for the structure below him. Every general officer in the German army now served at the personal pleasure of a man who had demonstrated that he would relieve anyone who disagreed with him. The incentive structure had been reversed. Auftragstaktik required generals to push back, to report honestly, to tell the man at the top when his plan was wrong. But the man at the top had just fired 35 of them for doing exactly that. The system didn't collapse overnight, but it began to rot. By the summer of 1944, the rot had penetrated all the way to the Western Front. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B in Normandy, had spent weeks before the Allied landings arguing that the panzer reserves needed to be positioned close to the beaches, that the battle for Normandy would be decided in the first 24 hours, and that if German armour could not reach the beaches quickly, it could not reach them at all. His superior, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief West, disagreed. Von Rundstedt wanted the panzers held back in a central reserve, to be committed only once the main Allied landing site was clear. Hitler resolved this disagreement by giving himself personal control over the panzer reserves, specifically the Panzer Lehr Division, the 1st SS Panzer Corps, and the 12th SS Panzer Division. Neither Rommel nor von Rundstedt could move them without Hitler's direct authorization. On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. Hitler was asleep. His staff did not wake him. By the time he authorized the movement of the panzer reserves, it was the afternoon of D-Day. The critical window, the hours when German armour might have driven the Allied beachhead back into the sea, had closed. The panzers that did reach the front faced Allied air power, which confined their movement to night marches and reduced their effectiveness by 30 to 40% before they ever engaged Allied ground forces. The structural failure that Rommel had warned about had come to pass, not because of Allied genius, because Hitler had centralized control of the most critical asset on the battlefield and then been unavailable at the moment of decision. That was the system working perfectly. The broken system. Part 2. The breakout they couldn't stop. By late July of 1944, the Allied position in Normandy had been stable for nearly 7 weeks. The British and Canadians under Montgomery were pinned, or appeared pinned, around Caen, fighting for every hedgerow in the Bocage country that favoured the defender. The Americans under General Omar Bradley held the western end of the Allied line, from the base of the Cotentin Peninsula southward. Patton's Third Army was not yet officially operational, but Patton was in Normandy, waiting. On the 25th of July, Bradley launched Operation Cobra. The concept was straightforward: saturate a narrow section of the German front with strategic bombers, then push armoured columns through the gap before the German line could reconstitute. The bomber attack by more than 1,500 B-17s and B-24s dropped nearly 4,000 tons of high explosives on a section of German line approximately 6 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep. The Panzer Lehr division, which held that section, was effectively destroyed in the first hours. Its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, later said that his division had lost 80% of its effective strength before a single American infantryman crossed the start line. 80%. Panzer Lehr was one of the best equipped divisions in the German army. It had been formed specifically from demonstration and training units, the best officers, the best NCOs, the best equipment. It was gone in an afternoon. The gap that Cobra tore in the German line was roughly 6 kilometers wide. That was enough. American armoured columns poured through it, and within days, the breakout had become a rout. By the 1st of August, Patton's Third Army was officially activated and moving. Moving is too small a word. Patton's armour was running, south through Avranches, then fanning out in two directions, west into Brittany and east and southeast into the open country of the Loire Valley and beyond. Meet Captain William Knowlton, 26 years old, from Brattleboro, Vermont. Before the war, he had been studying engineering at Dartmouth College. He was now a tank company commander in the 4th Armoured Division, which was leading the southern thrust of Patton's breakout. In his after-action report, filed in August of 1944, he described the movement as unlike anything he had trained for, not the set-piece attacks he had rehearsed in England, but a continuous advance where the objective changed every 12 hours, and the greatest threat was running out of fuel before the Germans could organise a defence. His company covered more than 40 kilometres on some days. The Germans they encountered were not the organised resistance of the Normandy hedgerows, they were fragments, rear area troops, administrative units caught in the open. The German front in Normandy was not retreating, it was dissolving. Here is the key detail: the dissolution was not uniform. The German line around Caen, where the British and Canadians faced the bulk of German armour, was still coherent. 7 of the 8 panzer divisions in Normandy were concentrated in the east, facing Montgomery. The western flank, where Patton was now operating, was held largely by infantry divisions that had been ground down by 7 weeks of attrition and had no armour to speak of. When Cobra hit that western flank, there was nothing behind it. Von Kluge saw this immediately. So did his army commanders. The logical response, the response that Auftragstaktik demanded, was to begin an ordered withdrawal eastward, to shorten the line, to pull the panzer divisions away from the British front and use them to create a new defensive line further east before Patton could swing north and cut off the entire army group. Von Kluge requested permission to begin this withdrawal on the 2nd of August. Hitler refused. Instead, Hitler issued the order for Lüttich. Stop and think about that. The entire German position in Normandy was collapsing from the west. The rational response was to retreat east. Hitler's response was to attack west, toward the sea, into the teeth of Patton's advancing army. The stated objective was Avranches, the bottleneck through which all of Patton's supplies and reinforcements were flowing. If German panzers could reach Avranches and hold it, they would, in theory, cut Patton off from his logistical base and collapse the entire American breakout. In theory. The operation was called Unternehmen Lüttich, Operation Lüttich. Hitler's directive specified 8 panzer divisions for the attack. His generals, von Kluge, General Paul Hauser commanding the 7th Army, General Heinrich Eberbach commanding the Panzer Group, told him that 8 panzer divisions did not exist in a usable form. The combined panzer strength they could actually assemble for the attack was roughly 145 operational tanks across 4 divisions. The Panzer Lehr, which Hitler included in his order of battle, had been destroyed in Cobra. The other divisions were at 30 to 60% strength after 7 weeks of continuous fighting. 145 tanks. Against a position defended by 5 American divisions with air support from more than 400 Allied aircraft operating in clear summer weather. Von Kluge told Hitler this: he was told to attack anyway. The attack began in the early hours of the 7th of August 1944. In the darkness, the German armour achieved local surprise. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 1st SS Panzer Division pushed through the American lines near Mortain and advanced several kilometers westward. For a few hours, it looked, from the German side, as though the attack might be working. Then the sun came up. Allied fighter bombers, Typhoons of the RAF 2nd Tactical Air Force and P-47 Thunderbolts of the American 9th Air Force were in the air before the German columns had finished forming. The pilots had been briefed on the German attack before dawn. They found the panzers on open roads in clear weather, and they worked through them systematically. By the afternoon of the 7th of August, the German advance had stalled. By the 8th, it was over. The attack had gained a maximum of 11 kilometers at its deepest penetration, nowhere near Avranches, which was 50 kilometers from the start line. The Mortain counter-offensive had failed, and here is where the trap closed. If people like Captain Knowlton kept records of what they saw on the roads around Mortain, the burning vehicles, the columns of prisoners, the abandoned equipment, those records are in the archives. What they describe is not a defeated attack. They describe the beginning of an encirclement. Because while Hitler's panzers were pushing west toward Avranches, Patton's Third Army was pushing north and east around the German flank. The pocket was forming. If this investigation has given you a clearer picture of how a military machine can be turned against itself by the man commanding it, not through cowardice, not through incompetence at the tactical level, but through the systematic destruction of the very command structures that made it effective, hit the like button. It keeps this kind of forensic history visible, and it matters. Part 3. The pocket closes. The geography of what happened next is the geography of a closing hand. Imagine the German Army Group B as a fist pushed westward into Normandy. The knuckles are the panzer divisions, attacking toward Avranches. The wrist is the narrow corridor running eastward through the town of Falaise, which connects the German forces in Normandy to the rest of France and to Germany beyond. If that corridor closes, the fist is severed from the arm. On the 8th of August, the same day the Mortain attack stalled, the Canadian First Army launched Operation Totalize, pushing south from Caen directly toward Falaise. Simultaneously, Patton's 15th Corps, commanded by General Wade Hayslip, was swinging north from Le Mans toward Argentat. The two forces were converging on the same point, the gap between Falaise and Argentat, through which the only road out of the pocket ran. The distance between the Canadian advance and Patton's advancing columns on the 8th of August was approximately 55 kilometers. 55 kilometers, and it was closing. Von Kluge understood what was happening before most of his subordinates did. On the 9th of August, he sent a message to Hitler's headquarters, the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, in East Prussia. That is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of the Western Front. He did not use the word encirclement. German officers had learned that using that word in a message to Hitler was dangerous. Instead, he described the situation in terms that any professional soldier could decode. The flanks were threatened, the attack toward Avranches had not achieved its objectives, and the army group required freedom of action to adjust its positions. Freedom of action, that was the phrase. It was the most careful possible way of saying, "Let me pull back before it's too late." Hitler's response arrived the same day. The attack toward Avranches was to continue. The panzer divisions were not to be withdrawn. Von Kluge was to find additional forces and renew the offensive. Read that again. On the 9th of August, with Canadian forces pushing south toward Falaise and American forces pushing north toward Argentat, with the pocket already beginning to form around the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army, Hitler ordered the attack toward Avranches to continue. He was not uninformed. His intelligence services were reporting the Allied movements. The Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, the ones that got through the Allied fighter screen, were confirming the flanking movement. Hitler knew. He looked at the map, saw the encirclement forming, and chose to interpret it differently. In his reading, the Allied forces swinging north were an opportunity. If the panzer attack could reach Avranches and cut the Allied supply line, the encircling forces would themselves be cut off. He was going to trap the trappers. This is the moment where the decision-making failure becomes total, because what Hitler was describing, the trap within the trap, was not a fantasy in the abstract. It was a fantasy given the specific forces available. 145 operational tanks against 5 American divisions, with 400 Allied aircraft overhead in clear weather. The Auftragstactic system existed precisely to prevent this kind of thinking, to ensure that the man at the top was confronted with ground truth before he committed to a plan. But that system had been dismantled. The generals who might have forced the confrontation had been relieved or had learned not to push. Now meet General Walter Model, 53 years old, from Gentin in the Prussian province of Saxony, career soldier, commissioned in 1910, wounded 3 times in the First World War. By 1944, he had a reputation as Hitler's fireman, the general sent to stabilize fronts that were collapsing. He was known in the German army as der Führer's bester Feldmarschall, the Führer's best field marshal. He had survived where others had been relieved because he had mastered the art of telling Hitler what Hitler needed to hear while quietly doing what the situation required. On the 17th of August, Hitler relieved von Kluge and appointed Model to command Army Group B and the Western Front simultaneously. Von Kluge, driving to his new posting, stopped his car in a field near Metz, took a cyanide capsule and died. He was 59 years old. Model arrived at his new headquarters and looked at the map for the first time. What he saw was this. The corridor between Falaise and Argentan had narrowed to approximately 8 kilometers. The entire German 7th Army, roughly 100,000 men, was inside the pocket, along with elements of the 5th Panzer Army. The roads inside the pocket were clogged with vehicles, horses, artillery, and the debris of a dissolving army. Allied artillery was firing into the pocket from 3 sides. Allied aircraft were working the roads continuously. Model immediately requested permission to withdraw the remaining forces through the corridor. Hitler granted it, but the permission came with conditions. The flanking positions were to be held. The withdrawal was to be conducted in an orderly manner. Equipment was not to be abandoned. Equipment was not to be abandoned. Inside a pocket being compressed by 2 Allied army groups, with the exit corridor narrowing by the hour, Hitler was still issuing orders about equipment. The corridor closed on the 19th of August, when Canadian and Polish forces from the north linked up with American forces from the south at a small village called Chambois. The precise moment of closure, the handshake between Polish Major Zygmunt Szydłowski's forces and American Lieutenant Colonel John Hanson's men, happened in the early evening. The pocket was sealed. Inside it, the remnants of 2 German armies. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. The forensic verdict of this investigation is as follows. The Falaise pocket was not primarily a failure of German tactical execution. It was not a failure of German courage or German professionalism. The men fighting inside that pocket, the panzer crews, the infantry, the artillerymen, were, by any objective measure, among the most experienced soldiers on the Western Front. They had survived 7 weeks of the most intense attritional fighting in the European theatre. They fought their way to the corridor under continuous air attack and artillery fire, and a significant number of them got through. Estimates suggest between 20,000 and 40,000 German soldiers escaped the pocket before it closed, though they escaped largely without their equipment. The failure was structural. It was the failure of a command system that had been deliberately broken. Count it yourself. Hitler made 3 decisions in the first 2 weeks of August 1944 that sealed the fate of Army Group B. The first, he refused von Kluge's request on the 2nd of August to begin an orderly withdrawal eastward. That decision kept the German armies in a position where they could be encircled. The second, he ordered the Mortain counteroffensive, Operation Lüttich, with forces that his own generals told him were insufficient. That decision drove the German panzer strength westward, away from the corridor that would later become the only exit from the pocket. The third, he refused, on the 9th of August, to authorize a withdrawal when the encirclement was still forming and the corridor was still 55 kilometers wide. That decision converted a dangerous situation into a catastrophic one. Each of these decisions was made against the explicit advice of the generals on the ground. Each of them was made in the context of a command system, where the consequences of disagreeing with Hitler had been demonstrated repeatedly and brutally. Von Kluge's predecessor, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had been critically wounded on the 17th of July, when his staff car was strafed by an Allied aircraft. He was recovering at home in Germany when the Falaise pocket closed. He would be dead by October, forced to take poison after being implicated in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler. Von Rundstedt had been relieved in early July for telling Hitler's chief of staff that the only sensible course was to make peace. His replacement, Field Marshal Hans von Kluge, was now dead in a field near Metz. The men who might have stopped Hitler's decisions were gone, dying or silent. Now consider the scale of what happened inside that pocket. The German losses at Falaise were staggering. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers were killed inside the pocket. Approximately 50,000 were taken prisoner. The material losses were, in some ways, even more significant. Approximately 500 tanks and self-propelled guns were captured or destroyed, along with roughly 1,500 artillery pieces and more than 2,000 motor vehicles. The 5th Panzer Army and the 7th Army, the 2 formations that had held the German line in Normandy for nearly 3 months, ceased to exist as coherent fighting formations. 500 tanks, 1,500 artillery pieces, 2,000 vehicles. For context, the entire German armoured strength committed to the Mortain counteroffensive, the attack that Hitler believed would cut Patton off and reverse the Allied breakout, was 145 operational tanks. The pocket consumed more than 3 times that number in captured and destroyed armour alone. The men who escaped the pocket, those 20,000 to 40,000 soldiers, crossed the Seine River largely on foot, without their equipment, without their vehicles, without their artillery. They were not an army, they were survivors. When they reached the German border weeks later, they were reorganized into new formations, given new equipment and told to hold the West Wall. They held it, for a while. But the formations that had been destroyed at Falaise, the 1st SS Panzer Division, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr, the 9th Panzer, the 10th SS Panzer, those formations never fully reconstituted. The experienced NCOs and junior officers who had been the backbone of German tactical effectiveness in Normandy were dead or in Allied prisoner of war camps. The most brutal irony of all deserves to be stated plainly. Hitler's stated objective at Mortain was to cut Patton off from his supplies and reverse the Allied breakout. The actual result of the Mortain attack was to drive the German panzer strength westward, away from the corridor, at precisely the moment when that corridor needed to be defended. The attack that was supposed to trap Patton became the mechanism that trapped the German 7th Army. The counteroffensive that was supposed to restore the German position in Normandy became the action that made the destruction of Army Group B's combat power irreversible. Hitler trapped himself, with his own order, against his own general's advice, in full knowledge of the Allied flanking movement, and in the belief that his operational genius would find a way through. Walter Model, who arrived too late to prevent the encirclement but managed the escape of those tens of thousands of survivors, continued to command on the Western Front until the final collapse. He was never tried at Nuremberg. On the 21st of April 1945, In a forest near Duisburg, he shot himself. He was 54 years old. Günther von Kluge, who had spent 2 weeks trying to tell Hitler the truth through every indirect channel available to him, died on the 17th of August 1944 in that field near Metz. He had written a final letter to Hitler, which was delivered after his death. In it, he told Hitler that the soldiers of the German army had fought with extraordinary courage and that the outcome had not been their fault. He asked Hitler to show greatness by ending the war. Hitler read the letter and concluded that von Kluge had been in contact with the Allies, planning to surrender. He ordered the letter filed. The letter was filed, and so we return to that road south of Falaise. August 1944. Günther von Kluge standing at the edge of a field, watching the sky. He is watching the Allied aircraft that he cannot shoot down, flying over ground he cannot defend, carrying supplies to armies he cannot stop. He has sent his reports, he has made his requests, he has used every word available to him short of the word that would get him relieved or worse. He knows what is coming, he has known for days. The pocket is forming around him and around the 100,000 men under his command. And the man who could have stopped it chose instead to order an attack that made it inevitable. There is a particular kind of professional tragedy in being right about everything and having no power to act on that rightness. Von Kluge was right about the withdrawal. He was right about the insufficiency of the Mortain forces. He was right about the corridor. He was right about all of it, and he knew he was right, and he sent the reports anyway, and the reports were filed. The Auftragstaktik system, that century-old structure built on the premise that the man at the top must trust the men who can see the ground, had been built precisely to prevent what happened at Falaise. It had been built by men who understood that a general who cannot be told the truth will eventually destroy the army he commands. By August of 1944, that system had been dismantled so thoroughly that the truth could not reach the man who needed to hear it, and the man who needed to hear it would not have listened if it had. The Falaise pocket was not the moment Germany lost the war in the West. That moment had come earlier, perhaps at Cobra, perhaps at D-Day, perhaps in the years of attrition on the Eastern Front that had bled the Wehrmacht before a single Allied soldier set foot in Normandy. But Falaise was the moment when the structural failure of German command became irreversible. The formations that died in that pocket could not be replaced. The experienced soldiers who were captured would not return. The equipment that was abandoned on those roads, 500 tanks, 1,500 guns, 2,000 vehicles, was not rebuilt in time to matter. Hitler had ordered the attack that would cut Patton off. Instead, he sealed his own army inside a pocket that destroyed it. And the generals who knew it was coming had already learned that knowing was not enough. If this investigation gave you something real, a clearer picture of how command structures fail, how the men closest to the truth are sometimes the least able to act on it, hit the like button, subscribe if you want the next chapter, and remember this: the most dangerous commander in any army is not the one who lacks information. It is the one who has dismantled every mechanism that would force him to believe it. The sky over Falaise was full of Allied aircraft on the 19th of August 1944. Von Kluge was already dead. The pocket was already closed.